Hey, Brad Sousa here, CTO at AVI Systems. For the last several months, there's been a number of announcements made in the UC marketplace that have had significant impact. And as a result of that, a number of our customers have asked us to share our observations, maybe give some guidance as to what this means to their overall UC strategy. So for the next few minutes here, we want to share with you 4 specific observations and make some short-term recommendations that'll help you win with your UC strategy given these recent announcements. Before I get into those specific details, I think it's important for us to maybe share an idea or perspective around any technology innovation or emerging trend. See, from AVI's perspective, the most significant impact is actually the human impact. And what we mean by this is that we need to evaluate these emerging trends or changes in the industry through the lens of how it impacts people in their use. And so we ask ourselves the questions before we begin to get into the details of any particular new announcement. We ask ourselves the question, how does this give velocity behind what we're trying to accomplish organizationally? Or how does this improve the overall adoption of this technology by our user communities? It's really around understanding the human impact. And that's vitally important because in our industry, especially in the UC space, the average product life cycle is about 6 months. And so instead of changing with every new innovation, what we want to do is measure those innovations through this filter of human impact and how it changes the way that people consume this technology. So let's get into what's happening in the UC marketplace and talk about these 4 key observations that are changing what we're doing today. So the UC marketplace has been focused on solving 3 specific problems over the last year or so. The first is what we call device independence. Device independence is this notion that today's work group is made up of people that are gathered together in a common space, a meeting room or a conference room as an example, and are connected to individuals that can use whatever device they want. It might be a personal device or it might be a company-issued laptop as an example. And that users really don't care what they're using. They just want to collaborate together, solve problems, and work together on creating work product. The second big problem that the industry's been facing is this idea around hybrid and ecosystems. A few years ago, everything was focused on selecting a specific platform, but today, most organizations have a combination of platforms. That might include hybrid, both on-prem as well as in the cloud, or it might include an ecosystem that involves multiple cloud solutions together. And the third big thing that the industry's been focused on is what we call the simplified workflow, or adding simplicity to the user experience. This is sometimes referred to as click to join or one-touch dial. Whatever the term is that you use, the idea is that users don't want to have to dial a bunch of digits or type in a long URI. They just want to walk into a room to get a meeting started and do the same thing that they do from a laptop. Click on a meeting invite and join the meeting, irrespective of what cloud service is being used or what collaboration platform is the company standard. And so these 3 priorities have been the focus of the industry and are in fact the focus of the most recent announcements that we've heard in the UC marketplace. So let's take a look at those particular announcements and start by talking about what's the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. Well, the nature of the problem is actually pretty complex. The idea is that we want to be able to create this interoperability between multiple cloud services and platforms without sacrificing the simplicity of use and without having to sacrifice the ability to join from conference rooms, personal devices, and company-issued compute machines. Now, this is particularly a challenge when you consider that more than 80% of all enterprise organizations today have multiple platforms, multiple UC platforms, even on their own enterprise architecture. Now, sometimes these platforms are on-prem plus cloud. Sometimes these platforms are multiple clouds together. It's pretty common for us to hear users talk about how they have, as an example, Zoom plus Microsoft or Cisco plus Microsoft. And the idea here is that we want to be able to create one single unified workflow and connect into whatever platform we want, not just as a guest, but as a host user. Now, this problem, more or less, we say belongs to Microsoft. That's partially true. And the reason we say this is for 2 reasons. Number one, we recognize that both WebEx and Zoom have created an interop option on their own, and they happen to leverage industry standards for video conferencing that has been around for years. Microsoft is really challenging this, and they're saying that way of creating interop or using those standards, while it may connect most of the time and work most of the time, it's kind of clunky, and users really don't want to have to go through this process of dialing a bunch of digits or typing in a long URI, and then trying to address all of the rules that go along with creating interoperability around firewall rules, as an example, or how meeting invites are being sent, or all of these kinds of things. Microsoft's really challenging the notion and saying there should be an easier, simpler way that addresses this interoperability across multiple platforms and creates interoperability across the ecosystems without sacrificing the simplicity of one-touch dial. Today, that solution is really around using a third-party software application known as CVI, or Cloud Video Interop. And that Cloud Video Interop, or CVI, has been provided by companies like Poly or Pexip or BlueJeans in the past. Now we get to the announcements. What do these announcements really mean? Well, in July of last year, Microsoft announced end of life for Skype Online. That's Skype in O365, and announced that the end of life is actually July 2021. And right after that, in August, they also announced end of life of Skype Voice using ACP. This really transitions Skype Voice, or Microsoft Voice, to something that's more competitive around BroadSoft or 8x8 or RingCentral, as an example. And then in October at Zoomtopia, Zoom announced that they would create what's called a WebRTC guest interop from Zoom rooms into Microsoft Teams meetings. And Microsoft at the same time announced that they would create WebRTC guest services from a Microsoft Teams room into a Zoom meeting, thereby using some sort of web browser as the connection between these two platforms. And then in November at Microsoft Ignite, Microsoft and Cisco made a similar announcement about the use of WebRTC from Microsoft Teams rooms into WebEx meetings, and from Cisco WebEx Teams rooms into Microsoft Teams meetings. And then Cisco went one step a little further and said, we're also going to joint develop with Microsoft their own version of CVI to compete with Poly, Pexip, and BlueJeans. All of these solutions are expected to be available early 2020, but the idea behind them is still a bit vague. We're not really sure whether or not the click to join is going to work on all occasions, or whether you have to have certain licensing levels in order to make this work. In some cases, we believe it will. In some cases, we believe it won't. And so what we're recommending is that in each of these cases, we look at how it fits into your specific UC strategy and then validate whether or not it's a real value. So what's the impact of these announcements? Well, the biggest shift is around what we call interop at the edge. So for years and years now, the video conferencing and collaboration space has mimicked what the phone industry originally started. It was this idea that you had an enterprise architecture that was spoke and hub, and that these spokes would connect to a hub or a centralized data center. And the centralized data center would create connectivity inside the enterprise, and then leave the enterprise to some sort of cloud service or just the internet at large to connect to other enterprises. This hub and spoke architecture has been around for years, and that's been the basis of how UC and collaboration has worked. But with this idea of using web-based services to connect into multiple clouds, now our conference rooms are really interop at the edge. And what we mean by this is that each of these conference rooms on their own will want to traverse the nearest connection to the internet and then join the meeting by joining into whatever the native cloud service that meeting is being hosted in, regardless of whether it's Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, or some other platform. Now, we believe that the use of WebRTC brings with it some real hope for simplicity, because it should relieve the need to have a lot of core infrastructure. But WebRTC also brings along with it a certain amount of complexity. That complexity comes with the limitations and problems that are associated with WebRTC. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Today, if I want to join a WebEx call using WebRTC, I need to download a WebRTC plugin into my browser in order to make that work. Likewise, if I'm using Microsoft Windows 10 and I want to use WebRTC, I'm actually using Edge as my browser. And Edge inside of a Microsoft Teams room is not natively WebRTC, it's EdgeRTC. And it's unknown right now whether or not that slight change from WebRTC to EdgeRTC is going to create some interoperability problems. We'll know as soon as the software is released and available for test, but right now it's a little uncertain. We also recognize that the introduction of WebRTC fixes the specific use case, or hopes to fix the specific use case, where most of my meetings are inside my organization. And when I meet inside my organization, I use this one specific platform. I only join meetings in another platform when I'm joining meetings from somebody outside, and that's pretty rare. Well, the reality is, as I said earlier, most enterprise organizations have multiple cloud services and have both on-prem as well as cloud services for their UC architecture. And the use of WebRTC there as a successful solution to create a unified workflow in those environments is yet to be seen. We do believe, however, that this is going to push the competition or the focus of UC not just on the cloud, but now to the conference room. And as a result of that, we expect that those conference room leaders like Crestron, Logitech, Poly, they're not just going to walk away from conference rooms. They're going to find new ways to compete. And as a result of that, create new services for our customers. And we think that that's good for everybody involved. So what's our short-term recommendations? Well, really our short-term recommendation is don't change anything. Don't change anything until the GA releases, the general availability releases of these new versions of software are made available, and that we've had the opportunity to do a pilot and compare the performance of these solutions against the current solutions to determine whether or not they really move forward your organization. It's back to that idea of human impact. Is this going to change the way that people consume this technology? If it does, and it creates an improvement, let's go with it. If it doesn't, it might just create complexity, and let's slow down a little bit if that's the case. The second thing is we're leaning towards room designs that are able to be updated and able to have services added remotely in the future. And then lastly, we're recommending that we double down on enterprise applications for provisioning, commissioning, troubleshooting, and support. Now, it's important to remember that these WebRTC announcements are really meant for those users that are using primarily one platform inside their organization, and then once in a while have a need to join somebody else's platform that's different. If you have multiple platforms inside your organization as it is, or if you have a hybrid environment, WebRTC may not be able to solve the problems that you need long term. So lastly, here's what our recommendation really is for you. Our recommendation is before you make any change, we recommend that you go through a proof of concept and then a pilot to validate how this is really going to provide velocity behind your current UC strategy. Now, you can do that with AVI by reaching out to your AVI account manager or by going to avisystems.com and clicking on Contact Us and filling out the request form online. We'd be happy to talk with you about your specific use cases, the expectations of your user communities, and how these solutions may provide velocity and improve adoption. Happy to talk to you about this, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. I'm sure there's more to come.